There are places on this earth that don't want to be found. Places that feel like a wound in the crust of the world. In the middle of a remote stretch of Texas lies one of those places. Locals call it the Devil's Sinkhole. But at the very bottom of that sinkhole, behind layers of limestone and ancient rock, is a network of flooded caves known as the Devil's Throat. It is a world of absolute, crushing darkness. A place where the water is so still, it feels like solid glass. And for most people, the mere thought of entering it is enough to trigger a panic attack. But for Vicki Ferguson, it was home. Vicki wasn't an amateur. She was one of the most elite cave divers in the country. She didn't just dive for fun. She was a cartographer of the void. She was a woman who made maps of places where human eyes were never meant to see. Vicki was meticulous. She checked her tanks 3 times. She obsessed over every knot in her safety line. She knew that in a cave, a single mistake isn't just a problem. It's a death sentence. In May of 1998, Vicki and her diving partner, Paul, prepared for their most ambitious mission yet. They were going to map the deepest, narrowest section of the throat. A place where the walls were so close together, you had to exhale just to squeeze through. But as they stood at the edge of the water that morning, the air felt different. The water, usually crystal clear, had a strange, milky haze, as if the mountain was trying to hide its secrets. Vicki looked at Paul. She didn't say anything. She just adjusted her mask. And with a single splash, she vanished beneath the surface, unaware that she was swimming into her own grave. To understand the danger Vicki was facing, you have to understand the physics of the Devil's Throat. It's not just a cave. It's a vertical chimney filled with water. As you go deeper, the pressure begins to squeeze your lungs. The nitrogen in your blood starts to fizz like a soda. It creates a sensation called the rapture of the deep, a feeling of intense euphoria that makes you forget you need to breathe. Vicki and Paul were descending into the restriction zone. At this depth, the passage was less than 4 feet wide. Imagine being buried alive in a cold, liquid tomb. Every movement has to be calculated. If your fin hits the wall, you kick up silt. And in a second, the water turns into a cloud of brown dust. You become blind. You lose your sense of up and down. Vicki was leading the way. She was the point person. Her job was to lay the gold nylon line that would be their only way out. Paul followed behind her, watching her lights. In a flooded cave, light is everything. As long as you can see the beam of your partner's flashlight, you are safe. But Vicki's lights were flickering, not because of the batteries, but because of the shadows the jagged rocks were casting. The walls of the cave were covered in sharp, ancient fossils. They looked like teeth, rows and rows of limestone teeth. Vicki was moving with perfect grace. She was a shadow moving through a ribcage of stone. They reached the 300-foot mark, the deepest anyone had gone in this section. Vicki signaled to Paul with her hand. Okay. But as Paul looked at her through the green-tinted water, he noticed something strange. Vicki wasn't looking at him. She was staring past him, into a dark corner of the cave where his light couldn't reach. Her eyes were wide. And for the first time in 10 years of diving together, Paul saw Vicki Ferguson look afraid. The restriction zone was behind them. Now, they were entering the pinch. This was a section of the cave so narrow that you couldn't wear your oxygen tanks on your back. Vicki and Paul had to unclip their primary tanks. They had to push them in front of them like a battering ram, pushing the heavy steel cylinders through a hole barely wider than a man's shoulders. The water here was colder, a biting, ancient cold that seeped through their thick neoprene suits. Every breath Paul took sounded like a thunderclap in his ears. Hiss. Click. Hiss. Click. The sound of survival. Vicki was still 10 feet ahead of him. Her fins were moving in a slow, rhythmic frog kick. It was a technique designed to keep the silt on the floor undisturbed. Because if the silt rose, the cave would disappear. They would be trapped in a whiteout of mud and darkness. But something was wrong with the current. Usually, the water in the throat was stagnant, dead. But Paul felt a tug, a gentle but persistent pull from deep within the rock. It was as if the cave was breathing in, sucking the water, and everything in it deeper into the abyss. He looked at his depth gauge. 340 feet. They were at the absolute limit of their equipment. Vicki stopped. She reached out and touched a jagged rock formation. She was securing the gold safety line to a limestone anchor. This was the point of no return. Beyond this anchor lay a vertical shaft that dropped another 100 feet. A black hole in the middle of a flooded mountain. Vicki turned her head back toward Paul. Her powerful diving light hit him square in the eyes. For a second, he was blinded. When his vision cleared, he saw her give the signal to hold. She wanted to scout the entrance of the vertical shaft alone. Just 10 meters. Just to see if the map continued. Paul nodded. He gripped a rock to stay steady against the strange current. He watched her swim away. A small, flickering star in a universe of black water. Paul checked his pressure gauge. He was running low on air. He looked down at his wrist to check his decompression timer. It was a routine move, a mechanical habit. He looked down. He saw the glowing numbers on his watch. He looked up. 4 seconds. That was all it took, in the time it takes to check a watch. Vicki Ferguson was gone. Paul didn't panic at first. He assumed she had just swam around a jagged outcrop, or perhaps her light had been obscured by a fold in the rock. He shone his own high-intensity beam into the shaft. Vicki! He couldn't speak, but his mind was screaming her name. The water was perfectly clear. There was no silt cloud, no bubbles from an exhaling diver, no flickering light in the distance. Just empty, silent water. Paul swam forward to the spot where he had last seen her. He reached the limestone anchor. The gold safety line was there, but it wasn't tied to the rock anymore. It had been cut. The end of the nylon rope was frayed, as if it had been snapped by a massive force. Paul felt a surge of adrenaline that threatened to make him black out. He descended into the vertical shaft. 20 feet. 40 feet. The current was stronger here. It was pulling at his mask, trying to rip the regulator out of his mouth. He shone his light down into the deep, and that's when his heart stopped. Far below him, at a depth that no human could survive. He saw a light. It was Vicki's primary dive light. It was sitting on a ledge, pointing straight up at him. The beam was steady, unmoving. But Vicki wasn't holding it. The light was resting on the stone, illuminating the empty water above it. Paul checked his air again. 5 minutes left. He had to choose. Try to reach the light and die with her, or leave his partner in the dark and live with the guilt. He looked at the light one last time, and as he watched, something moved across the beam. A shadow. Too large to be a fish. Too fast to be a human. Paul had to leave her. It is the hardest decision a diver can ever make, to turn your back on your partner in the darkness. But his lungs were burning. His equipment was screaming at him in a series of sharp, metallic beeps. Low air. Low air. He began the slow, agonizing ascent. In cave diving, you can't just swim to the top. If you go too fast, the nitrogen in your blood will turn into bubbles. It will tear your joints apart. It will stroke your brain. Paul had to stop every 30 feet. He had to sit in the dark, clutching the safety line for minutes at a time. waiting for his body to decompress. And in those minutes of silence, the horror began to set in. How? How could a woman as experienced as Vicki disappear in 4 seconds? There were no tunnels she could have swum into. There was no struggle. And that rope, the gold nylon line, was rated for thousands of pounds of pressure. It doesn't just snap in still water. It looked like it had been pinched by a giant pair of shears. When Paul finally broke the surface of the sinkhole, he was screaming before he even took the regulator out of his mouth. The support team on the surface pulled him onto the rocky ledge. He was shaking so hard he couldn't stand. "She's gone," he gasped. "The light. Her light is still on at the bottom." The team looked at each other. They knew the depth Paul was describing. 400 feet. At that depth, the water is like lead. The pressure is enough to crush a car. They realized this was no longer a rescue mission. It was a recovery, but the mountain wasn't done taking its prize. 24 hours later, the best cave recovery team in Texas arrived. These were men who specialized in bringing bodies out of the most impossible places. They brought specialized mixed gas tanks. They brought underwater drones. And they brought a grim sense of professional detachment. But as they prepped their gear at the edge of the Devil's Throat, the divers noticed something that made them pause. The water level in the sinkhole had dropped. Not by inches, but by feet. Overnight, thousands of gallons of water had simply vanished into the limestone. One of the lead divers, a man named Dave, descended first. He reached the pinch, the narrowest part where Vicki had vanished. He moved with the caution of a man walking through a minefield. He shone his light down into the vertical shaft. Vicki's light was still there. After 24 hours, the battery should have been dead. Waterproof lights at that depth usually only last for 6 to 8 hours. But this beam was still strong, still steady, still pointing directly up at the surface. Like a beacon, Dave descended toward the light. He reached the ledge where Paul had seen it last. He reached out his hand to grab the flashlight. But as his fingers brushed the metal casing, the light flickered once. Then it slid off the ledge. It didn't fall like a heavy object in water. It moved as if something had pulled it into the deeper shadows below. Dave stopped. He looked at his depth gauge. He was at the limit. But then, he saw something else on the ledge. Something that didn't belong in a prehistoric cave. It was a small, white object, tucked into a crevice in the rock. He pulled it out. It was a laminated ID card. Vicki Ferguson's driver's license. It was perfectly clean. Dry. As if it had just been taken out of a wallet and placed there an hour ago. Inside a flooded cave, 400 feet underground, Dave felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the water. He signaled to the surface. "I'm coming up. Now." Dave returned to the surface with the ID card. The atmosphere at the base camp was no longer just somber. It was terrified. How could a plastic card stay dry under millions of gallons of water? And why was it tucked so neatly into the rock? The team spent the next 6 hours analyzing the sonar data. The Devil's Throat wasn't behaving like a normal cave anymore. The water pressure was fluctuating. It was pulsing, like a giant, subterranean heart. Dave and a second diver, named Mike, decided on one last attempt. They used a deep mix gas, mostly helium. To prevent the hallucinations of the deep, they descended past the 300-foot mark. Past the pinch. They reached the ledge where the light had been. It was gone. The beam that had been burning for over 30 hours had finally vanished. But as they shone their own spotlights into the vertical shaft, they heard it through the thick, pressurized silence of the water. A sound that shouldn't exist. A metallic tapping. Clink, clink, clink. It was rhythmic, intentional. It was coming from inside the rock walls. Dave pressed his helmet against the limestone. The vibration was so strong he could feel it in his teeth. It sounded like someone was on the other side of the stone, trying to hammer their way out. But they were 400 feet underground, encased in solid granite and limestone. There were no air pockets, no secret rooms, just the crushing weight of the Texas earth. Dave signaled to Mike, "Follow the sound." They swam deeper into a section of the shaft that was so narrow that the walls began to scrape against their tanks. And then they saw it, floating in the middle of the passage. Vicki's secondary mask. It wasn't floating toward the surface. It was pinned against the ceiling of the cave by a force that seemed to defy the current. While Dave and Mike were in the depths, the technician on the surface was watching the sonar screen. The device was sending sound waves down into the shaft to map the area. Suddenly, the screen began to glitch. The clean, gray lines of the cave walls started to distort. "Dave, Mike, come in," the tech whispered into the comms. "I'm seeing a massive mass moving toward you from the lower gallery." The divers stopped. They looked down. Below them, the vertical shaft continued into a black void. "What kind of mass?" Dave's voice crackled through the radio. It's not solid," the tech replied. "It's moving like a liquid, but it's denser than the water." On the screen, a large, amorphous shape was rising from the bottom. It looked like a cloud of ink, but it was moving against the current. Dave and Mike shone their lights down. They saw nothing but the clear, green-tinted water. But their depth gauges started to spin. The needles were moving from 400 to 200, then back to 500. Their equipment was failing. The pressure sensors were being overwhelmed by an unknown magnetic field. Suddenly, Mike grabbed Dave's arm. He pointed at the wall of the cave. In the beam of their lights, the limestone seemed to be shifting. The teeth of the rock were retracting, and the tapping sound stopped. Replacing it was a low, vibrational hum, a sound so deep it made their vision blur. Dave realized they were no longer in a natural formation. The devil's throat was changing its shape, closing the exit. "Get out, now!" The tech screamed over the radio. The two men kicked their fins with everything they had, fighting a current that had suddenly turned into a whirlpool. They barely made it through the pinch. As they looked back, they saw the narrow hole they had just crawled through. It wasn't just filled with silt. The rock itself had collapsed, sealing the lower chamber forever, with Vicki Ferguson and her mysterious light still inside. After the narrow escape of Dave and Mike, the authorities made a decision that shocked the diving community. They didn't just suspend the search. They ordered the entrance to the lower galleries of the Devil's Throat to be sealed permanently. A massive steel grate was brought in, bolted into the limestone with heavy industrial anchors. The official reason was unstable geological conditions. But the men who were there that day knew the truth. The mountain hadn't just collapsed. It had reacted. Dave, the lead recovery diver, sat in the base camp for hours, staring at the dry, laminated ID card he had found at 400 feet. He kept thinking about the hum, the vibrational frequency that had almost paralyzed his heart. He consulted with a geophysicist from the university. He showed him the readings from their failed depth gauges. The scientist looked at the data and went pale. "This isn't just a magnetic anomaly," he whispered. "This is a localized gravity fluctuation." He explained that for those needles to spin like that, the weight of the water itself would have had to change. As if, for a few minutes, the laws of physics inside that shaft had simply been suspended. It would explain why Vicki's light didn't fall, why it drifted like a feather, and why a woman who had spent her life navigating the dark couldn't find her way out of a 10-foot wide hole. But Vicki Ferguson was gone. But she wasn't lost in the way we understand it. She had been integrated into the mountain. Before the steel grate was finally welded shut, the recovery team lowered one last high-definition camera into the shaft. They wanted to see if the collapsed rock had shifted again. The camera descended slowly. It passed the pinch. It reached the spot where the vertical shaft began. But the camera didn't see a wall of fallen limestone. Instead, the lens captured something that the FBI later confiscated. The walls of the cave were smooth, polished, as if they had been sanded down by a giant machine. And there, etched into the side of the stone, were symbols, not ancient petroglyphs, but modern markings. They looked like the mapping symbols Vicki used in her notebooks. A series of arrows and lines, pointing deeper into the earth. But Vicki didn't have a hammer or a chisel. She only had her hands. The tech watching the monitor reported seeing a faint, blue glow coming from behind the rock. It wasn't the white light of a flashlight. It was a bioluminescent pulse, like the heartbeat of a deep-sea creature. Suddenly, the cable to the camera was cut. Cleanly, identical to the way Vicki's safety line had snapped. The team pulled the dead cable back to the surface. When it reached the air, the end of the steel wire was glowing. It was hot to the touch, as if it had been severed by a high-intensity laser. The site was cleared within 2 hours. The divers were told to sign non-disclosure agreements. The story of Vicki Ferguson was buried under layers of bureaucracy. But sometimes, on very quiet nights in the Texas desert, hikers near the Sinkhole say they can hear it. A rhythmic tapping coming from deep underground. Clink, clink, clink. Vicki Ferguson is still down there, and she's still trying to finish her map. What happened to Vicki Ferguson defies every logic of modern science. When we look at the facts, they don't add up to a simple drowning. Divers don't vanish in 4 seconds in clear water. Nylon ropes don't snap like dry twigs without a massive physical force. And ID cards certainly don't stay dry at the bottom of a flooded shaft. Some geologists suggest that the Devil's Throat sits on a unique tectonic junction, a place where the Earth's magnetic field is thin. They argue that the hum Dave and Mike heard was the sound of a subterranean cavitation, a phenomenon where water moves so fast and with such pressure that it creates a vacuum, a pocket of nothingness. If Vicki had been caught in a cavitation bubble, she wouldn't have just drowned. She would have been crushed into a microscopic point in less than a second. But that doesn't explain the light. It doesn't explain the symbols on the wall. It doesn't explain the hot, laser-like cut on the recovery camera's cable. There are others who look at this from a darker perspective. They call it a spatial anomaly, a glitch in the fabric of our three-dimensional world. They believe that certain places on Earth act like a one-way door, a place where, if the conditions of pressure, light, and sound are exactly right, a person can simply slide out of our reality into a place where time and gravity don't work the same way. Vicki Ferguson was a mapmaker. Perhaps she stumbled upon the one place that was never meant to be mapped, a place that the Earth protects with its own terrifying set of rules, rules that we are only just beginning to fear. Part 12. The final map. Characters. 1009 Hun. Focus. Penutup emotional. Philosophies. Dan call to action. Today, the Devil's Throat remains silent. The steel grate is still there, rusting in the damp air of the sinkhole. Vicki Ferguson's name has been added to the long list of those taken by the missing 411 phenomenon. But for her family, and for Paul, the mystery isn't a theory. It's a ghost that lives in every drop of water. Vicki died doing what she loved. She died pushing the boundaries of the known world. And perhaps, in some way, she succeeded. If those symbols on the cave wall really were hers, it means she didn't panic. It means that even in the face of an impossible alien darkness, she was still a professional. She was still trying to show the rest of us the way. We like to think we have explored every corner of this planet. We have satellites that can see a coin on the sidewalk. We have submarines that can touch the bottom of the ocean. But as the story of Vicki Ferguson proves, there are still holes in the world. Dark, silent places where our technology fails and our courage breaks. Places that remind us how small we really are. Thank you for joining me in the deep today. If you found this story as haunting as I did, please like and share your theories in the comments. What do you think happened in those 4 seconds of darkness? I'm Mrs. Ballenina, and I'll see you in the next mystery. Until then, stay safe and be careful where you step. Today, the Devil's Throat remains silent. The steel grate is still there, resting in the damp air of the sinkhole. Vicki Ferguson's name has been added to the long list of those taken by the missing 411 phenomenon. But for her family, and for Paul, the mystery isn't a theory. It's a ghost that lives in every drop of water. Vicki died doing what she loved. She died pushing the boundaries of the known world. And perhaps, in some way, she succeeded. If those symbols on the cave wall really were hers, it means she didn't panic. It means that even in the face of an impossible, alien darkness, she was still a professional. She was still trying to show the rest of us the way. We like to think we have explored every corner of this planet. We have satellites that can see a coin on the sidewalk. We have submarines that can touch the bottom of the ocean. But as the story of Vicki Ferguson proves, there are still holes in the world. Dark, silent places where our technology fails and our courage breaks. Places that remind us how small we really are. Thank you for joining me in the deep today. If you found this story as haunting as I did, please like and share your theories in the comments. What do you think happened in those 4 seconds of darkness? I'm Mrs. Ballenina, and I'll see you in the next mystery. Until then, stay safe, and be careful where you step.